exactly. And when Wesley's, oh, come on. Crowning with many crowns, exactly. Come on.
Say a little prayer for the computer. It might move right along.
Well, the problem is the screen is, and Microsoft does not work well together. And,
While you're trying to figure that out, Pat is celebrating 50th anniversary.
Yes.
wow! Happy birthday to
No.
No.
Happy anniversary. We're not gonna go there. Okay, that's fine. I invited you. Are there prayer requests besides what we mentioned for Martha? Are others in need? Other prayer requests that you would like this evening?
Could you send a big prayer out to teachers?
Teachers.
That's a good one.
And the governor, maybe he'll see the light.
And if anybody's interested, Wednesday from 4:30 to 6:30 on Broadway from Congress all the way to Pantano, up there on the street. If you wear red, that'd be
Wow.
nice.
That's Wednesday evening?
Wednesday from 4:30 to 6:30. I'll be down on the Broadway Park area.
We'll be about 10 minutes.
Yeah.
That's, I think in many ways, this, you could attribute this in many ways to many of the social issues that Wesley dealt with in his time. Miners made hardly a living wage. Most of them did not earn a living wage.
Did any of them?
And how many hours a day do they have to work?
Well,
16?
and there was no age limitation, so it was kids in the mines as well. My point, I guess, is that social issues are part of what we're going to talk about tonight in terms of, we've already mentioned it several times, but Wesley's idea of holiness is both personal and social holiness. And so our call really is to be with those who are in need of support, financially support, with freedom support in many ways. So that is a concern that the United Methodist Church should be involved in. That's true. Other prayer needs. Let us be in prayer. Gracious and loving God, we give you thanks for the opportunity to hear your good news and to understand how we as United Methodists have a role to play in bringing your kingdom good news to the whole world. Touch first, Lord, our hearts. Touch the hearts of those who are decision makers in our world and in our society and in our communities. Be with those teachers who are truly risking their livelihood, risking scorn, risking in many ways to bring to our attention the needs for kids in our schools. Help us to understand those needs and to help us as a class to bring voice to that call for social holiness to our congregation and to our denomination. Lord, touch our hearts. touch our hearts and our minds. Guide us and lead us always, in Jesus' name. Amen. Did anybody look up the name that I invited you to check on? What did you find out about Elias Shakur?
I would like to have known him.
Huh?
I would like to have known him.
Well, he's still living. We still have a chance if you want to go to Israel. I'll pass these around. These are both his first book called Blood Brothers, and this was the first edition, I think, of his book, and the other one is a later edition of the same book. This I think is the first edition. This is the first edition, and I think this is the latest edition. And you can look those. His books are available online to buy used ones and that sort of thing. I highly suggest. The reason I invite you to get to know. Somebody else want to share? I kind of jumped into this.
Well, I can say something. Catholic Bishop,
Archbishop, yeah.
Israel was interested in development for Palestinians, education, and welfare. On the other side, though, apparently asked to resign by the Pope because of suggestions of sexual harassment and financial mismanagement. So, a sinner, we're going to talk about.
Well, I think I read that as well, but based upon all that he has done, and he began a school in what used to be Galilee. It's in northern Israel, in that area. He's not Roman Catholic, he is a Melkite Catholic. They do have authority, they do respond to the Pope, but the Melkite Church follows more of the Eastern Orthodox ritual. They're kind of a bridge between the Eastern Church and the Roman Church.
Is it a Greek church?
No, it's not a Greek. At one, I guess when you say is it Greek, yes, at one level it ties into the Greek Orthodox, but it's kind of a hybrid in terms of that. But as a young priest, first of all, you can read his story in the book I passed around, but his family had lived for their ancestry in Palestine prior to the creation of the nation state of Israel. And when the decision was made to start the nation state, the Palestinian understanding was that Israel, or at least his family's understanding, was that they would be able to maintain their farm and their home. But when that all began to take place, they were basically pushed off of their farm and removed after having lived there for centuries. And they owned an olive grove. Basically, that was their living. But Elias went back into that area and he began a school. And his school has always been open to Palestinian children and Israeli children and other, all children were accepted at his school. Started out kind of as a kindergarten, elementary, and then grew into a school that goes all the way up to university level now. So, very prominent school. That's one of the reasons why I have a hard time believing that he has financial mismanagement or anything because of the success that he in a impoverished area. But anyway, that's my perspective after reading, kind of following him for years. I think it's sour grapes on the part of the Israelis is the reason the charges were made.
He was a candidate for the Nobel Peace Prize several years
Yeah.
in a row. He didn't win it, but he won several other
Yeah.
very special awards.
His line is, do not take sides. Love the Israelis, but don't oppose the Palestinians. Love the Palestinians, but don't hold the Israelis as enemies. In other words, he says it's the partisanship that is causing the problem. We need to support both sides and not one against the other. And that's basically his line. Anyway, interesting figure. He has, if you read that story, you're going to hear things that you've never heard before, associated from the United States. And when I was in Coolidge, there was a couple who had traveled to Israel, and they did meet him and did visit the school and participated in that. So he's about finding peace. He's probably one of the strongest peace advocates that lives and works there. Are there other things that, questions that are hanging over your head? So, other things that we have done? Talk about? Has Emmett, I had a problem with his email, and I'll correct that. Has everybody else been receiving the emails? I don't care if you throw it in a trash or what you do with it. I just want to make sure that I have your email. You didn't get it. Okay. So I need to check and make sure I got your email correct. Okay. What I sent out basically is just background that I had dug up on different things, and so which, as I said, is information you can use or throw away, whatever. Tonight, when we get to it, I think we'll do our video next. But then when we're going to get into talking about holy living, and we're going to talk about some of the idols that we deal with, which is part of chapter 2 and chapter 3, I think, in our book. So if you haven't read all the way through everything, that's okay. The reading assignments basically will just get us finished by the time we get to the end of our classes. And tonight we're going to look at the fourth session of, let's see here, if I can make things work. We're going to talk about the necessity of grace. It's a little loud.
Standing on Hannah Mount, which is in the Kingswood region, the coal mining region, which is a part of the greater Bristol area. And it was here in February of 1739 that George Whitefield, one of John Wesley's associates and friends, came and decided to preach out of doors. He records these words in his journal. He says, "I hastened to Kingswood. There were about 10,000 people to hear me. 10,000. The trees and hedges were full. All was hushed when I began. The sun shone bright, and God enabled me to preach for an hour with great power, and so loudly that I was told everyone could hear. "The fire is kindled in this country," he wrote, "and I know all the devils of hell should not be able to quench it." And he goes on to record how the miners were there, some of them in their black face, they're coming straight from the mines, and valleys of tears on their faces where they were weeping after the sermon. And this was recorded over and over again by those who came and preached in this area. He went on to write Wesley in London, said, "You've got to come here to Bristol." And Wesley came, and on April 1st, Wesley watched as once more George Whitefield preached to the masses. There were now 30,000 people who came to hear Whitefield preach. It wasn't on this particular mount on that day. And Wesley watched him, and he was skeptical of preaching outside of a church. In fact, at one point he said, "I wouldn't believe that anyone could even be saved outside of a parish church." But he stood and he watched the people, and he saw the power of God fall upon him. And as a result, he said, "I decided to be more vile and to preach out of doors." Now, he had good precedent, he said, because recently he had just preached a sermon on the Sermon on the Mount, and Jesus himself standing on a mount preaching and teaching. And so Wesley on April 2nd preached for the first time out of doors, and when he preached, there were 3,000 or 4,000 people who came to hear him. And on that day, while most came just out of curiosity, there were a handful who were serious and interested in the gospel that he proclaimed. Now, they didn't give altar calls then. That was invented in the 1800s. But the invitation was for those who were more serious to come and talk to him, and then he would encourage them to become a part of one of the societies. He continued to preach out of doors that month in the Bristol area, and 47,000 people came to hear him. It was astounding, and this was the beginning of the Wesleyan revival. He would go on to ride horseback across the British Isles. He would ride 250,000 miles in his lifetime. Wesley and Whitefield invited the miners and others who responded to the call to follow Christ to join one of 2 religious societies in the town of Bristol. These societies were smaller gatherings organized to help persons work out their salvation, to listen to preaching and teaching, to meet together in smaller groups, and to work together to serve the Lord. Soon these societies in Bristol were overflowing with people, and this led Wesley to acquire land in the city of Bristol for the building of a chapel that could house both of these societies, which joined together to become known as the United Society. The building that Wesley built became Methodism's first building. That building still houses a Methodist church to this day. And I'd like to take you there now, to the town of Bristol, to the New Room. In the spring of 1739, John Wesley arrived in the port city of Bristol, where he watched George Whitefield preach out of doors and began to see the way that God was working through that, and he began preaching out of doors. He preached that month to 47,000 people in Bristol, and as he preached, he invited those who were more serious about their faith. Most were just curiosity seekers, but he invited those who were more serious about their faith to become a part of one of the Methodist societies. There were societies, gatherings of Christians seeking to flee from the wrath to come. Not even at the time Methodist societies, but just societies, meeting in 2 different houses in Bristol. And he invited these new believers to join those societies to grow in their faith. And very quickly, those 2 houses were outgrown by the numbers of people who wanted to come and grow in their faith. And so they decided to buy a piece of land and to build a building, a meeting house for the societies. The people raised the funds for the land, and John Wesley guaranteed the funds to build the building, which would become known as the New Room in Bristol. This new room would be a preaching house, but it would also have apartments for John Wesley when he was here in town, Charles Wesley when he was here before he purchased his own home in Bristol, and then apartments for visiting preachers. There would be a meeting room in the upstairs for people to gather. And so we're standing here in front of the new room, the very first building owned by the Methodists, the very first preaching house. It's a very important building for us, and I'd like to take you inside. Let's go inside and take a look. So this new room, this preaching room, was not elegant, but it was fine. It was appropriate. It was a good space for the people to gather. They were grateful to have the space. The room itself could cram in 500 people if they were standing nearly, wall to wall or side to side throughout the building. And you can almost imagine as you stand here, those early Methodists singing Charles Wesley's hymns with such lust and vigor as they were worshiping God and as they were waiting to hear the preaching. Below me was the place where the scriptures were read, and then from this place, the preachers preached the gospel. Those Methodists would preach the word, the scriptures, and help people understand this is what it means to be a follower of Jesus Christ. As these 2 societies came together in this meeting house in the new room, They took on a new name. They had two separate names for the societies. These became now the United Societies. And that title would eventually stick to all of the societies across Great Britain who were a part of this Methodist connection that was emerging. Now, it was during this time that the organization of the Methodist movement began. Even though most weren't even using the term Methodist to describe what they were doing, it certainly began to emerge, this need to organize. And Wesley was an organizer. He was able to bring people together and think, what do we have to do to help them continue in the journey that they've started on today? So unlike so many crusades that happened maybe in America in the 50s and 60s, where people give their life to Christ and then maybe nothing would happen with them, Wesley was serious about taking the people who heard him preach out of doors and moving them into a society or a group of Christians that would help them continue to grow in their faith. So we want to talk just a little bit about that organization of the church that happened in 1739, 1740, 1741, and on from there, because that's what made it possible for there to be an enduring work of the Methodist movement long after Wesley was gone. So to do that, I want to take you upstairs to the third floor of the preaching room, the new room here at Bristol. Let's go.
Interesting furniture.
We're sitting in John Wesley's apartment on the third floor of the new room. And there's a sitting room here, period furnishings, some of which were actually Wesley's own furnishings. In what is the bedroom, you'll see a robe that was one of Wesley's preaching robes, and also a bed. And what happened during this period of time in the Methodist movement was the organization of the movement. So there were originally societies. These were not necessarily Methodists. They were groups of people who were coming together to flee from the wrath to come and to grow in their faith and encourage one another. But as Methodism began to take form, some of these societies became distinctively Methodist. So this was one portion of the organization. In addition to that, the members of the society were organized into bands. Those who were serious, even more serious about their faith, would come together in groups of 5 to 10. They would be separated, men and women, and married men and married women would be separated, so that people could be completely transparent and honest with one another. And the purpose of the band meetings was to confess their sins to each other, to inquire, how is it with your soul? What sins have you wrestled with in the last week? And then in addition to confessing their sins, to pray with one another, and finally to encourage one another. And though they've often been painted as sort of dour meetings, they were actually, as they've been described, moments that were genuinely filled with love and encouragement for one another, as the believers tried to hold one another accountable, as these early Methodists held one another accountable to grow in faith. And it was patterned after what Wesley had done even before the Aldersgate experience in Oxford, in his room at Lincoln College, where he and 3 others had come together to pursue holiness and a walk with God. And so this began the organization. There were the societies, and there were the bands, and then classes were organized. And the classes were organized first. They were all of the Methodists in a particular region, and one would be set aside as the leader of that class. And they would call upon the members of the class at their homes to collect an offering every week, which was to go to be able to build additional preaching houses or to pay off the preaching houses. And so it was a way of raising funds, actually. But eventually it turned into another accountability group for those who were not in bands. These classes began to meet together, and they began to grow in their faith. And ultimately, that merged into or morphed into what in many of our churches became the Sunday school movement, and today's small groups. But all of that started with the early Methodists in the way that they were organized. Actually, the Methodists and Moravians and several others. But that small group emphasis we see in the 21st century church that everyone says is so important, actually started in the 18th century as an important way of encouraging people to grow in their faith. Alongside the apartments on the 3rd floor of the new room is a common room. It was a meeting place for the Methodist preachers. And while services were going on downstairs, this room was host to services in the mornings and at night, almost every day. So morning services, night services, twice a day, 7 days a week. The preachers would be preaching downstairs. Wesley wouldn't attend all those services even when he was here, but he did keep up with his preachers. He evaluated them, and so he would stand at this window. He could open the window, and he could listen to the preaching of the preachers below, evaluate it, be able to critique it as he was trying to help them improve. One of the other attributes of early Methodism was the lusty singing, this passionate singing. Charles Wesley, of course, was the great hymn writer. He wasn't necessarily the one writing the tunes, but he was writing the poems that became the lyrics to the hymns. And I'd like to take you into his apartment, and we're going to remember for a moment the important contribution that he made to the Methodist movement. So let's go into his apartment, which adjoined, it was right next to John Wesley's apartment. Let's go. While we often talk about John Wesley and the founding of Methodism, almost equally important was his brother Charles. And Charles, of course, was a great poet. He was a preacher, but he was also a poet. He composed, as you probably know, thousands upon thousands of hymns that captured Methodist theology and the Methodist way and inculcated it. It drove it into the heart of the people, helped people memorize and understand their theology by singing it. Now, we're in Charles Wesley's apartment at the New Room in Bristol. Eventually, he would buy a house here and settle here with his wife and his children in Bristol. But at this point in Methodism's history, he was living in this apartment when he was here in Bristol. You can almost imagine him on a cold night in the winter warming himself at the fireplace here.
And it would have been cold in the winter. And wet.
And so we return to the New Room Chapel here at Bristol, and we remember how important those songs were that Charles Wesley penned for that early Methodist movement. In fact, to the present day, we continue to sing these songs, and they speak to our hearts. And probably all of you know the words and the tune to this song that Charles Wesley penned, celebrating the 1-year anniversary of his conversion. So he penned these words in May of 1739. "Oh, for 1,000 tongues to sing my great Redeemer's praise, the glories of my God and King, the triumphs of his grace. My gracious Master and my God, assist me to proclaim, to spread through all the earth abroad the honors of thy name. Jesus, the name that charms our fears, that bids our sorrows cease. 'Tis music in the sinner's ears, 'tis life and health and peace." Now finally, as we conclude this session, I'd remind you of the general rules of the Methodist people. So as Wesley was trying to help people remember simple rules, and remember many of these were coal miners and people were uneducated, they were simple rules he wanted every person to be able to remember so that when they woke up in the morning, they might say, this is how I'm meant to live my life. And there were 3 for the people called Methodists. By 1742, these were clearly articulated, if not long before that. But the first was that Christians were to avoid all the evil that they could, to stay as far away from those things that would offend God or hurt other people. They were to do all the good that they could, and to their fellow man, to the world around them. They were to do all the good, we often say it this way, they were to do all the good that they could, everywhere that they could, as often as they could, everyone that they could. This was the marching orders of a Methodist as they would wake up in the morning. The last was to attend the ordinances of God. That is to practice those things that help us grow in grace, to experience God's presence in our lives, and to grow in our love and knowledge of God. And so these would be things like the private reading of Scripture, the public reading of Scripture, attending services where you'd hear the preaching of the Word. It would be spending time in prayer, in small groups with other Christians, receiving the Eucharist, and any other practice that would help one grow in grace and in knowledge of Jesus Christ. So these are the general rules that people call Methodist. In this session, we've learned about Wesley's outdoor preaching, going where the non-religious and nominally religious people were in order to bring them to Christ. And we learned about Wesley's lifelong passion to do whatever it takes to reach them. We learned how Wesley wasn't content to lead people to Christ. Part of his genius was to develop a plan and an organization to help people continue on the path. We learned about the importance of meeting together for preaching services, and in the case of the New Room, how people would come together to sing and to praise, and that was characteristic of all of the Methodist gatherings, the great singing and the passionate preaching. And we learned about the general rules. These were all critical to the revival that swept Great Britain and later America, and critical to our own Christian discipleship today. So I'd ask you, is your church willing to do whatever it takes to reach non-religious people? Are you involved in a small group, a 21st century equivalent of a band or a class? And is your church helping organize these kinds of groups to grow in faith? And are you aware of and seeking to pursue the general rules, avoiding evil, doing good, and pursuing the practices that help you grow in grace? Because if you are, you're on the path to revival.
You talked about the general rules, and in the in our book of discipline, in paragraph 104, are listed these general rules, which are basically the general rules that Wesley wrote for the United Societies. And you can go there and find these, and they're pretty, I wouldn't say they're detailed, but doing no harm, the first, and he lists several things here that under that category. And then secondly, of doing good, and he lists several items here. And then thirdly, the attending upon the ordinance of God. Another way of saying that is, he said, staying in love with God, and being involved in worship and ministry, Eucharist, family and private prayers. And down here I said, he left out, Adam Hamilton left out fasting. But fasting or abstinence is one of the things that Wesley recommended. Wesley fasted at least 1 to 2 days a week throughout his life. See, was there something else that I wanted to? Everybody understand the societies, the bands, and then the classes, and how that the history associated with that. And 4,000 times the same. We've all sung that.
Yeah.
Again, a powerful song that Wesley has put. One of the things he didn't mention, and I found out, was that he built a new room, and this was a new building. The new room was a new building that Wesley, he bought the land, and then Wesley himself actually financed the building of it, and then through the classes and raising of money, I assume was paid back for that. And but in the same year, in 1739, they bought the foundry in London, and that became the hub within London of Methodism. The foundry, as its name implies, was an old armament building where they made ordnances for the military. And it was a vacant building when Wesley came, and the history that I read said it took 800 pounds, that's the British currency, to renovate. 800 pounds in that day and age would have probably been like $150,000 today. But the interesting thing about the foundry, a lot of commentators share, is that here was a building that was used for weapons of war that became the focus of a ministry to praise God and lead them. What had happened in that foundry was it was owned by a private individual who was making this, and they were, I can't remember exactly what they were casting, but they had the cast in the floor, and one of the casts had moisture in it, and I don't know if you know what happens to moisture in a cast exactly right. It, basically, when they began to pour the hot molten, I think it was brass, I can't remember anyway what they were pouring into it, but it basically exploded, and it killed the owner and killed most of the workers of the foundry, and then the foundry closed. So foundry was vacant for quite a number of years before Wesley came and bought it and repurposed it. So, I want to go ahead, George, and turn the lights back on. Thank you.
I know, because that's where my son works.
Yeah. You don't want to mix hot metal and water. It just becomes very explosive. So, Any questions on the video? Anything new? Yeah, George.
Talk about sermons out of doors. We spent a lot of time in Lake Tahoe, and the church we attended had in the summer they had their services outside, and the lectern was a big redwood stump. And the preacher would stand there, and the lake was in the
Beside
back.
the lake, yeah.
I was in the back, the whole lake. And it was really fabulous.
Be hard to pay attention to the sermon with a setting like that.
Right. Yeah, it was easy. It was easy until the speedboats came by.
Beautiful setting.
Yeah, it was.
My wife and I honeymooned in North Lake Tahoe. And we've been back, I guess, only once since then, but that was beautiful. Anything else? I'm going to invite us to turn to, let's see, page 27. In our book. And would someone like to read, on page 27, there's a section called Practical Divinity. And Wesley's primary concern was holy living, which is characterized by loving God and one's neighbor with Christ-like love. Someone want to read that for us? Belt it out.
I believe the merciful God regards the lives and temper of men more than their ideas. I believe he respects the goodness of the heart rather than the cleanliness of the head, and that if the heart of the man is filled by the grace of God and the power of the Spirit, with the humble and gentle and patient love of God and man, God will not cast him into everlasting fire prepared for the devil and his angels, because his ideas are not clear, or because his conception and confusion. Without holiness, I own, no man shall see the Lord, but I dare not add or clear ideas.
I don't know what he means by that last sentence, but that I don't think that's the main point of his paragraph there. Comments? Any arguments with that? Is that the normal good news that you hear?
One of the things he was fighting was the predestination thing.
Well,
and
yeah.
the people not wanting to be thought of as having the same kinds of sin as the minor would. So he's lifting them up in this way.
Well, he lifts them up in this way. It's about a matter of the heart, not just a matter of the mind. And I think we find today much of that within Christianity, where it's all about, quote unquote, what I believe. Belief, and what we've done in the Western world, which is we made belief a thought process. And in the ancient world, in the time of the writing of the New Testament, belief was not a mental construct. Belief was heart and action. So belief had to be physically displayed. It wasn't, when you talk about love, love was not just an idea or a concept, it was an action. It was a decision you made and an action that was performed, especially when you talk about the agape love. And so Wesley, I think, is tying back into the ancient understanding of belief. He's saying it in a little different way, but he's saying it's a matter of the heart. And we'll refer to this a little bit more in detail, but I would remind you of Galatians 5:22 and 23. And we'll look at that in a little bit as well. Any other comments? I like Pat's idea that he's kind of leveling the playing field by saying to these minors that they have just as much of an opportunity to be in God's grace. They don't have to be learned. It's the matter of the heart. Is your heart in the right place? And I think many of us may know people who they've resisted saying they are a Christian, but yet their heart seems to always be in the right place. They're taking care of others. They care for God's creation, and they have a gentleness and a warmth about them. And I have a hard time, like I think what Wesley is saying here, of saying that God is not going to welcome them just because maybe they have not, in the words of other Christians, quote unquote, accepted Jesus as their Savior. And that becomes kind of a mental construct in our society, and I think we have to be careful about that.
Pastor, I think too that the last few lines of that paragraph also suggest forgiveness.
Okay.
And I agree that it also puts out there that God, this creation, loves his creation.
Yes.
And he loves us as part of that creation. And if I acknowledge him, I can come to him then and say, you know, I'm approaching a new day, and I usually say this in my morning prayers, and here's my plans. I realize you may change those plans. And then I can ask for forgiveness of my sin.
Right.
Anytime I let anything in this world come between me and God, or the Holy Spirit that resides within me, God is a jealous God, and it disappoints him.
Well, I think that's
Say,
right.
"Damn it, I can't believe you did that." But I can ask for forgiveness. And my predicament is that I have to live in the world, but my goal is never to become of this world. So,
But I think to separate ourselves in saying, well, I don't want to be part of the world, but the reality is that's where we are. We're part of God's creation, and so are other humans. Most of us preachers have a line that we use frequently. We say that the church would be a marvelous place to serve if it weren't for the people in it. You know? And sometimes we have that. But what Wesley is calling us to is to a heart, and he's saying a heart filled by the grace of God and the power of His Spirit. I think Methodists are people who acknowledge the work of the Spirit within us, and part of that work is a humbleness. One of the scriptures that I love the most is in the Old Testament, and it comes from Micah 6:8, and it's, what does the Lord require of you? But
do justice, do mercy, and
walk humbly with your God. And basically that's what Wesley is saying here: humbleness, gentleness, and patience. Those are all ideas that fall within love and justice as well. So,
I think another thing is maybe that children who are loved in the church context find it easy to come to faith, and for them it's not a matter of intellectualism or theology or anything else. They just respond to the love that they experience.
some of you may be involved in the Kairos ministry, or when I've worked on a Kairos team and been in a
prison setting. One of the things that I've learned is that love and acceptance can break down some of the strongest and most permanent barriers. And it's interesting that in 3 days, what can happen around the table when you sit and listen and show love. And it became very clear to me that love is one of the most powerful, or is the most powerful element in the world today. It can change our world in dramatic ways. And I think Wesley showed that through his ministry of holy living. The idea of showing love and compassion to the minors, showing love and compassion to the children and families of the minors by building schools and providing feeding programs. And he was one of the first to do micro-lending, doing loans for that we would call today micro-lending activities. Because banks wouldn't loan to the poor. They would, and in those days, those who were in prison were generally mostly people,
Debtors?
yeah, they were put in prison for debt. And as a matter of fact, his father was in debtor's prison several times. So those are issues within the world that we're going.
Talking about love, and it's interesting, my sister from Washington State teaches autistic and brain damaged children from 4th through 7th grade. And she had one little boy that would just sit and cry. He was totally nonverbal, and he was just crying. And she got down face to face with him and said, "Boy, you really miss your mom." And that was the start of the breakthrough. That he stopped crying because somebody understood.
Somebody had shown, that love and compassion, and tried to hear. And that's one of the things that we found out within the Kairos community. Inmates, for the most part, have never had anybody listen to them. And generally I found out that their lives, when you look at from the beginning of their life, somebody has been telling them not to do this, not to do that, not to do this, not to do that. And of course, they didn't address the issues, and then you enter into the criminal justice system, and somebody then becomes definitely is telling you what to do. And then when they get into prison, they're told what to do all the time. And so for them to have somebody sit down and listen, just sit at the table and listen to their story, to hear it. The Spirit, you didn't have to say anything. God would change their heart just through that act of listening. So let's list some other things that maybe we can do that would be holy living activities.
Read the scriptures.
Come on, you guys.
Feed the
Holy
poor.
living.
Feed the poor.
Pray.
Forgive.
We used to say, sing the songs of Zion, but just singing.
Sing praise. What other, all of these are activities which, what happens outside of the church?
Being kind to everybody.
Showing love, compassion.
Volunteering.
volunteering to help, okay? Can I add that?
Asking what they want.
What else?
Charity.
One of the things that we as parents have the most hard time with, I think, is patience.
About evangelizing.
I think mindfulness, that you're in the moment, that you're paying attention to what's at hand, rather than, having your attention free.
Sense of presence.
How about evangelizing?
Can I use some other terms?
Maybe. Let's see.
Check first.
What's the other term?
Yeah, what is it first? Sharing the good news.
Sharing the good news. I'll go for that. It's okay.
That's all right.
I think, and the reason I like to use that is we need to have mindfulness that the good news that we are sharing is really the good news for the person we're sharing it with. I think so much of what we do in the church ends up not being good news for others, and especially when our good news begins to be colored by economic disparity, and I can go on, sexuality, and so on and so forth. So,
How about fellowship? What they were talking about, being together with other believers, to share challenges, learn.
Yep, fellowship is.
Reinforce how you feel when others feel like you.
Pardon?
Just fellowship, it reinforces how you feel when you're surrounded by people who
Okay,
feel or think the same way.
Support, lifting one another up. Encouraging one another. The small groups were part of that was encouraging one another, but it was also holding each other accountable in love. I mean, it's not yelling at somebody and saying, "Hey, you really messed that up," but it's saying, we've been there before, and it's a tough place to be, and let us walk with you to move along better. And I think that's for the past 35 years I've been involved in a small group. Now the people in the small group have changed as I've moved and that sort of thing, but actually it's been longer than that. It's almost 40 years I've participated, and I've seen the power of that small group to help other men walk a lot brighter path.
One of the things we talked about in men's Bible study is how retirement sort of frees you up, but the obverse of that is incorporating your faith into your workplace in some way, in terms of a holy living. I think that's one of the big challenges of holy living in this society.
Yeah.
Well, really the definition of holy living is incorporating I'm going to say the good news into our daily living.
And Sunday can be a little different than Monday through Friday.
Definitely. And this involves all of our. One of the things that I think is and this has come out recently, I think I probably shared it before, one of the worst things that happened to us is when we changed our name from the People of the Way to saying we're Christians. Because the idea of being people of the way meant that we were on a journey and we were having to deal with the good news and how we moved along in that journey. It wasn't again an identity, it was how we lived. And so that we were originally called People of the Way. Well, this is a nice list. Thank you. Where, if you were going to prioritize anything, I want you to maybe kind of turn yourselves around in groups of 3, and I want you to come up with about 5 off of that list. I want you to pick 5, and then we're going to come back and
Right, 5 that would be the most important.
what we think are most important. Okay? I'm going to give you about 5 or 6 minutes, so you don't have a lot of time. And so get your mind going and share. All right? Okay, so it's 2 or 3. I don't care. However you want to do it. George, you need to help Tina and Kathy here.
I go this way.
Okay, George, get over here.
You said,
There's a whole
You can rewrite them if you want.
It's hard to get these.
You're writing this down, I can forget them in 2 minutes.
What I was saying, that's how other than comfort, you can forgive them, but we can choose. Not forget, but it's like, and I can do that. I can forgive somebody. Good rules not the bad, it's very good news. Absolutely. That's what you're supposed to do. And you don't have to do this face to face. Then you ask them. And you don't have to solve just that other person. I had to realize I had to. And once I did that, I was able to let it go. Like that, pray, reading scripture. Save God, we want to save others. About charity. In terms of not being my personal belief, how to help others. So we're going to give charity every week, whatever it is they need. Open doors.
Well, step number 1 to accept the
I'll give you 1 more minute.
As I was saying in my apartment,
Volunteering.
we have 2 minutes to win it.
Kindness and, loving others.
Everybody notices do
Volunteering. How'd you write it down? Then what?
Basically helping them 7 years.
So you're really.
The ones aren't what they are.
And listening. What? Huh?
After that, I just
Yes, yes.
Okay, Emmett, you guys have a list of 5, go ahead.
Okay, well, actually, I think it goes into 6. Well,
Okay,
praying, forgiveness.
slowly here, praying, forgiveness,
Kindness,
kindness,
sharing the good news. And then that one prayer up at the top, incorporating the good news into our daily living.
okay, I don't know, that's not. Okay, next group, Sharon, Robert, Mary?
We had kindness and loving kind of together as one.
Kindness and loving, okay.
Loving others. And then volunteering is 2. Fellowship,
Fellowship,
listening, and forgive.
listening and forgiveness, okay? All right.
Kathy's our reader.
Well, we put loving others as number 1 because some of the other things come from loving. Our second one is listening to others. Then we have charity, sharing the good news, and prayer and reading scriptures.
Okay, next.
We have listening, kindness, patience, and also we need to be able to respond in a kind way when somebody talks to us. I think that was it.
Well,
In the moment.
did you already have kindness?
Yeah.
There you go.
Next.
Yes, I did.
Secretary.
So we have sharing the good news, loving others, charity, interpreting the good news into our daily lives, and forgiveness.
Okay, so
All covered.
if we had, this got pretty good. These are all the 3s, okay? So that would go on the top notch, and then here, and here, and here would be the bottom, or the middle, and then all of them, everybody got, each item got a vote, so the rest of them would be, there, so, okay.
Yeah, because we're an excellent class.
Okay, so that's just, that gives you some,
Everything's important there.
it is important, but, you might, look and see that different areas may be, more, important based upon where we feel holiness is, our life in holiness is. Some of us may need to work on kindness a little more than others. Some people may need to work on forgiveness more than others. Some of us may have a real sense of presence and mindfulness of the present, and others bless you. Listening is probably something that we all need help on.
We tried to break ours down into what we were doing for others to help their growth versus what we were doing for ourselves so that we continue to grow as well.
And this holy living, remember, is all about our personal holiness, and social holiness. So another way we could say this is self and others. And another way you could say this, it would be loving God and loving others. So,
But Ed, excuse me, can't we show loving God in loving others?
well, very, very much so. What was Jesus saying with the great commandment?
Love God first and then.
Well, I don't know that, I guess you can, depending upon what part of the Bible you want to quote that from. I see it as not a first and second, they are integrally related. You cannot love God without loving others. And you can't love others probably without loving God, truly. So, it's not a either or, it's a both and situation. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, your mind, your soul, your everything you are. And then love your neighbor as yourself. It's really connected. And Jesus says, he says the first is to love the Lord your God with all your heart. And he says the second is like unto it, which is almost like saying, chunk. You know, you can't do one without the other. And that's the point of Wesley's idea of holiness. It's both a personal holiness and a social holiness. This is loving the Lord your God with all your heart, your soul, your mind, your strength, and this is the loving of others. And so you can't have, Wesley's idea was, you can't have one without the other. You're missing the boat, or you've only got half a boat. You know what happens when you got half a boat?
You have a submarine.
No longer a boat.
At least no longer afloat, anyway. Okay. Well, sometimes we have some obstacles that get in the way of doing those things over there, and they're called idols. And in our reading, they listed several items. What were some of the items that he listed in terms of idols? You remember?
Well, there are a whole lot of things.
Money?
But I think, as I read that, I did have a critique of the way it was phrased, because if things take the place that God should have, they can be idols.
That's right.
Okay? But your nationality is not per se an idol. It's okay to have.
It can become an idol, though, in some cases.
Sure, but
and that's what he's saying.
And you can't let it be one.
Well, but in our society today, has nationality become an idol?
Well, arguably, nationally, yes. How's that for qualifications?
Well, you're absolutely you're right, Gordon, that almost anything can become an idol when it becomes out of proportion to what we're doing in terms of our life. I think what he was looking at in our, is what are the things in our culture today that have become idols that we don't think about. A lot of times when we think of an idol, we think of a little figure on a shelf or some, what the Ten Commandments call a graven image, but that really isn't the idol that Wesley is concerned about, or that the writer here. He's concerned about those things, exactly what you said, Gordon, that get in between our relationship with God and with others. And I mean, if success is so important to you that you treat others poorly, or you treat your family poorly, or you treat your children poorly, then it's become an idol, and it has caused us to get out of whack. So what were some of the other things he listed? He listed success. I know nationality. Was there something else there?
Money.
Oh, money.
Kind of sums up God.
Hedonism?
What define hedonism?
Pleasure seeking.
Pleasure seeking?
It feels good.
It feels good to do it. Okay. Anything else? Huh?
Food. You mentioned food, but food is a big idol.
Cars,
Right.
clothing, electronics.
I had the preacher that I loved to listen to. He was an Irishman, and he always said that when he talked about the sins, he says, we always like to talk about the sins we don't have. He says I don't have the sin of gluttony, but it looks like some of you might. So, but that's how we look, and in terms of our, we like to criticize the sins that we don't have, and not the ones that we have.
Now,
Okay.
somebody mentioned cars. I was certainly guilty of that when I was a youngster. I traded cars every 2 years for about 8 years. Looking back, I understand what I was doing. I was making my value by the new car I always
Right.
Then later I was in the trucking business, and then I chose to buy Kenworth and Peterbilt. So if you know about trucking, those are the two
Cadillacs of it.
And I was doing the same old thing.
It's changed, yeah.
So, and, just to cover a lot of territory, we could say things. Could be jewelry, could be
Electronics.
electronics. Oh, it's
I'm looking at money. Should that be money for the sake of money? Because money
we
can do a
might-
lot of good things.
Love.
Love
Yeah,
of
love
money.
of
Love of
money.
money. Yeah.
well, we might see it as security. And that, I think this is the thing that gets most of us, is that we're looking for security. And we think security comes in the form of wealth or money. And it could also be status. We want, in the love of money, could be a status situation as well. So and status could be found in several of these, I'm sure.
I think holiness can be an idol in the sense of holier than thou.
Okay, we can become pious in the wrong sense.
To a fault.
Pious. Not a vote. That's our musical interlude.
We're gonna do that.
Pretty sporty.
So we get, fought.
Or French, it's the foe.
Yeah.
I know what you meant.
Yeah.
You're right, I guess, but I think the important thing for us is to be willing, maybe not right here and now, and that's the good thing about a small group, is you can maybe sit down and you share with your brothers or your sisters what these things are. Because I can guarantee we all have them. And we can't deal with them unless we get them out onto the table where we can actually see what it is that we're having to deal with.
One of the ways you can tell is what bothers you about somebody else, what really bugs you and you don't see that much, you look that way.
That's a long list.
Get the mirror. Yeah.
My perspective on the idols is, I was pretty sick about 10 years ago with the life-threatening illness, and in the end, the only thing that matters, everything else is a stuff. It's your relationship with people.
Absolutely.
You know, and I mean.
But aren't these all about relationship too? It's about your relationship with God and relationship with others. So these are things also that get in the way of that relationship that you are trying to build with. And it's a good way of thinking about it. What's important in terms of the relationship? And sometimes our health can become one of these idols because it gets in the way. Well, I've got to do this, or I've got to eat this, and this, so that
You fixated. Yeah.
so even our health can become
Exercise.
a problem.
Well, you can spend vast amounts of money on health.
On health and
I think these discussions are good, and they're good for me because they bring out things that have happened in my past and observations that I have made that I hadn't put a name to or anything. But you know, I've seen a lot of tragedies too. You know, you talk about money for the love of money. One of my friends committed suicide because of a real estate crash.
Right.
You know, and
Because it was so important to him that he couldn't see life without that.
without the chauffeur-driven limousine.
And sometimes even relationships can become idols.
Very much.
Oh, movies, celebrity, big idol.
So,
Yeah,
okay,
you can
I
have
think
a lot of-
we've got the point. One of the things that I want to go back and I want us to look at, if you'll turn your hymnal back to 88. We're not going to sing. A lot of times when we sing songs, we don't really read the words. And I want us to just kind of look through the words and tell me, as you look at this hymn, what does it tell you about God? What do you see that tells you about God in this hymn?
He's our maker.
His is creating love. I guess that would go right along with me. He defines the triune God.
Yeah, the eternal triune God.
Eternal, triune,
Lord, power,
pardon?
incarnate deity.
And tell me, when we say incarnate deity, who are we referring to?
Jesus. The three.
So here's, becomes one of the Trinity. What else?
And the Holy Spirit too, I think.
Faithfulness as well. I mean, praising all of these things that are provided to us.
So he is worthy of praise, thanksgiving.
And we were all ransomed. We were once prisoners.
So he's a savior.
Yes.
Okay. All right. Let's move. Look at 339. And I bet this is one that you haven't sung that much. Maybe wrong. What's the title?
Come sinners to the gospel feast.
Come sinners to the gospel feast. Okay, tell me some of the theology of this hymn. By that, I'm talking about the relationship that we have and the actions. First of all, who are we?
Sinners.
Are just some invited? Who's invited?
All world. You need not one be left behind.
Who is being addressed here? By making that statement, I mean,
all humankind.
well, I think somebody mentioned here a little bit ago that he was that Wesley was arguing against the predestination, the elect. See, this is universal. It's not saying come those that you have accepted Christ. It's not saying come those who are saved. It's saying come everyone. And the gospel feast. How would you define what the gospel feast is?
That's the good news. It's not talking food.
Spiritual food.
Yes.
Wesley also may have seen this as communion. What else do you see here?
Well, he says, come all your souls by sin oppressed.
Okay.
It's what we face every day.
So we are oppressed.
You restless wanderers after rest.
Come all the world.
Yes.
So this all is a pretty big all, isn't it?
Yes.
All right. And what's going to happen when you come? Are you going to be just, oh, we're glad to see you type thing? Or how are you going to be received?
Welcomed.
What kind of a welcome?
A hearty welcome.
A hearty welcome.
In Christ, a hearty welcome.
So that means that, wow, we're so glad you're here. You know, it's,
Like my sister's quote, she said, God doesn't just love you, God is crazy.
crazy about you. That's right.
Crazy
Good.
in love with you.
That's right. Well, what I'm encouraging you, especially with Wesley's hymns, as we've said before, his theology is in those hymns, and when you sing them, especially with Wesley's hymns, you want to read those words, because there's a belief system there. There's the heart of belief there. And one of the things that, and I don't know this is true, you can prove me wrong, and I welcome that. But for the most part, in what I read in Wesley's is an uplift. All of the poems and poetry are uplifting. There's not, even though when he says sinners, he calls us sinners, it's an uplifting message. Come be a part of the gospel feast. Come into the presence of God. Be here, be present. And there's no condemnation in this. It's a hearty encouragement. You know, can you imagine the miners and the workers, those in the mills who have been put down all their life, and they can sing this song? They know who they are, and yet they know that God is welcoming them in. How uplifting can that be? And I think many times we hear songs today that just don't have that uplifting message, even in some of the hymns that we sing. So I would say that a majority of Wesley's hymns are very uplifting in terms of, sometimes the music they're put to is not real great. But I think if we took it and put them to music today that we enjoy and like, it would be a great combination. I think we've probably covered enough tonight. There's another hymn there that we could sing, or I invite you to look at. It's number 60. I'll praise my Maker while I have breath. You will hear how this was a hymn that Wesley sang while he was basically on his deathbed. The idea, while I have breath, I'm going to praise. And when I'm gone, all earth and heaven continues the praise of God. So it's a powerful witness. I will cease and say that we are done. I'm done talking. Would somebody like to close this with prayer?
And I would just like to say something to Michelle and any teachers in the group.
Amen.
I'll make it short. I've been a teacher in this district, and I've been a principal in this district and an administrator. I want to say to you, take courage. We will be praying for you to continue to be safe and to get the kind of results that you want. We really are on your side, and I want you to know that when I was in my second year of the principalship at a school here in Tucson, our teachers walked out. Out of 21 staff members, I had 3 teachers and 600 kids. But God will make a way, and you will be able to do what you need to do. And so we'll be praying for you to just have courage and stay on the battlefield.
That's right.
And some of the churches are, and this is something I haven't talked to Tony about, and I don't know whether anybody in the church is planning on, but on Thursday, when many teachers are going to be out many churches are opening their doors to provide care for the children that
That's nice.
may not have a place because their parents are working and,
School is closed.
and school is, then they're,
Well, one of my friends contacted me and said that there's a single teacher at, Sabino with 3 kids living paycheck to paycheck.
Yeah.
I'm like, what is she gonna do? She's really torn. And so I said, here's the phone number for the community food bank at my church, the Methodist will feed you.
There you go.
Let us know what we can do, and, don't worry about it.
well, and I think, I know Desert Skies is working on a plan to take care of kids who, will be, so,
We have lived in a small community in Minnesota, north of the Twin Cities. And our district, the teachers went out on strike. And it was cold, and it was snowy, and the Methodist Church opened their doors, and they had coffee, bathrooms to use. The members are bringing in food, you know, for them to eat, because they were walking the picket line, and it was about 5 degrees above zero.
yeah.
And it was just the basic comfort. And after that experience, of course, it also helped that our pastor had been a high school biology teacher. And never went into the seminary. You know, so he has had a very wide range of experiences. But he said, that's why we're here.
I think one of the things that all of us could maybe help realize that the funding of our education and our teachers in Arizona in particular, but I think it applies probably to most of our nation, is done in a way that is not equitable. It's done on property taxes. And if you've got a city where, or an area where there is, well, I'll just, for instance, I was in Coolidge. I served Coolidge in Florence, Arizona. Coolidge is primarily a farming community. There's really no other agriculture, nothing there other than dairies and agriculture in terms of business tax base. And you might know that farmland is not very highly taxed, and there's a good reason for that. But Florence now has prisons. And prisons provide a tax base for Florence. So the Florence school is doing really well. They can build new buildings, and their teachers are more highly paid and they have better programs. And Coolidge has a high turnover of teachers because they can't pay the teachers and that sort of thing. But it's because of the way the tax, the way we have chosen to support education is very inequitable, and not in a state in which, in Nevada, 75% of the land is held by government entities. Arizona is about 50% of the land is held by government entities. So that removes a lot of tax base out of our state. So
It depends on the agency.
Yeah.
Some federal governments give, it's worked into their annual budget every year, and they give so much money to the county, that would approximate what the taxes would be.
But I don't know if any of that money gets into the school districts.
Well,
I don't know either. I'm just saying we have a problem in terms of how we've decided to fund our education system, which means the only way it's going to get changed is by citizens in the state demanding that we find a better solution for solving our solving our system. Not to let any of our politicians off the hook. I'm not saying that, but but it goes in some ways deeper than that. So, definitely something to pray for. Let's be in prayer. Gracious and loving God, we ask that you would just walk with us. Help us to be mindful, Lord, of your presence. Help us to be mindful of those around us and the needs of others. Help us to just be open through your Holy Spirit to loving others as we love you. Guide us and lead us. Be present for the needs of each one around us. Lord, be with those. Be with those teachers. Be with the administrators. And open our hearts to care for the children. Caring for our children is not just hope for the future, it's hope for today. Hope for the time present. They have so much to offer us. And guide us and lead us, that we might be your people, bringing your kingdom into reality in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you all for sharing and your ideas. How was the hearing? Huh? Well, just the next two, I think it is.
It would be 6 and 7. We were to be 3 to 5, 3, 4.